So I'm Deirdre. I guess, most of you know who I am, but it's also a fact that I've been in the party since the beginning, since it was founded, which is 50 years almost. And so a lot of what I'll tell you, I'll be telling you, actually from my own recollections, but not everything, because some subjects may come up that I was too young to actually participate in, or not even born yet, maybe. I'm sure in the course of our discussions we'll talk about a lot of things. But I did want to mention this is the 50th year of publication of the paper. A paper is dated really sort of ahead. I mean, when you're putting out your very first issue, it's already issue number 1. So this is now, it's volume number 1. So this is now volume 50 of Workers' World Newspaper, which means we're in the 50th year, but the party will actually be 50 years old come next February. That's because we were formed in 1959, and that will be February of 1909, and that's 50 years. And what I was thinking of for today, and this is just the beginning, of these discussions, really, is to begin really with going over some of the highlights of activities that the party was in the first 2-3 decades of our existence. So you get a sense of the continuity, that what we're doing now is totally consistent with what the party was doing then. Which just doesn't mean that we don't learn and, expand our horizons and all. But from the point of view of our general attitude towards imperialism, towards the national question inside the U.S. and around the world, to the need for the working class to be organized to overthrow capitalism, this is, just bedrock in our party. So, and then what I want to do is from that, which is just a sort of an overview of some of the highlights of what the party has actually done, especially in a slightly earlier period. Then we'll go from there to the discussion of the ideology that underlies everything, because it's not that we are just reacting to one thing at a time. We have an overview of history, of society, of humanity, really, that is the underpinning, and which is why our party has been a viable organization for 50 years, and is building, has confidence in the working class, even though this has been, and I really want to stress this has been an extraordinarily reactionary period in which to build a revolutionary workers' party. It really has been, with some periods of greater struggle, like especially the 60s, the early 70s, but in general, this has been a period where nationally and internationally, the working class movement, and to some extent, especially more recently, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union, the national liberation movements have taken big blows, and many, many organizations that came up out of the struggle of the 60s died out not long after that wave of enthusiasm and energy was sort of expended and was swallowed by the 70s and then the Reagan period and all that, and they kind of just disappeared. So for our party to survive, it's really important to understand the party's ideology and our long-term view and what has sustained us through a most difficult period in history, but one that is very much, we're on the cusp of a big change, and you all sense it, I'm sure, because the conditions, the material conditions of life for the working class here and for workers around the world are undergoing enormous changes that disrupt the stability of this capitalist system and open up the possibility for there to be much more rapid political development and change and struggles on the part of the working class to assert itself as the most important class in society, the one that makes everything, work, but has been held down in a totally subordinate condition by the ruling class. So what I want to start with, and I think that the classes that have been organized by FIST, which LeiLani has played a big part in, have been really effective in getting everybody's participation through reading some of the material out loud. So what I'd like to pass around to you is a document that was prepared about 10 years ago. I don't remember the circumstances under which we got it out at the time, but it's called Workers' World Party's Proud History of Struggle. And as I said, it's like an overview. You know, it's like the highlights of many things that the party did after it was formed. And I want you to feel free. This is not, we're not going to just read the whole thing and then discuss it. I want you to feel free to, make comments or ask questions at any point along the way. We'll read it like a paragraph, or maybe even, if it's a long paragraph, maybe even half a paragraph at a time, and then take a little pause, see if anybody wants to pick up on it, has something to say. And then we'll go on. And then after we finish with this one, then we'll go on to another document which has to do with the party's ideology and what made it a distinct political tendency when it was, why it was formed, why we couldn't just be in some other party, already existing party. It's a very deep question. Nobody should start a party just because they want their name up in lights or something. It has to be a real reason to start a party. So maybe we could start with Jamie and work around that way.
Just read the first paragraph?
Yeah, just read the first paragraph.
The Workers' World Party was founded in 1959, a few short months after the Cuban Revolution. It was a time when revolutionary anti-imperialist struggles were growing in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Here in the U.S., the struggles against national oppression were building in strength, and the working class and progressive movements were beginning to emerge from the difficult days of the oppression.
Okay. Questions about what it's describing, how this period when the party was formed was described? Let me just say a little something here about what it was like. When we're talking about the movements just beginning to emerge from the difficult days of the McCarthyite repression, there were so many things about that period that were so different from everything you're used to today. For example, here in New York City, and New York City was always considered a very liberal, if not radical, city in those days compared to the rest of the United States. Here in New York City, we set up a youth group in 1962 called Youth Against War and Fascism. And we went out with banners and placards and stuff on our demonstrations. And that was almost unheard of. And chanting. There was a peace movement at that time, and they would do nothing but silent vigils, and sometimes hardly even with a sign. I mean, you got to get a feeling for what it was like, how repressed everything was. And, this was before the women's movement, this was before the LGBT movement, this was before the anti-war struggle broke out. In terms of consciousness about war, the main issue that was being raised was the possibility of a nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and most people were scared out of their wits by that. And there was no militant anti-war movement at that point, right, in 1959 when the party was started. So just that's I want you to get a picture of what it was like when we say beginning to emerge from the difficult days of the McCarthyite repression. Because in the 50s, we were in another party. We didn't form Workers' World out of nothing. We were in a party that we didn't agree with on very big issues, and we'll get to that later on. But throughout really the whole decade of the 50s. But the idea of starting a new party under the conditions then, it was pretty much, you would be pretty much doomed to fail. It was not a period of, in general, of growth of the left. Now, there was the beginnings of the civil rights movement, but I'm just trying to put this all into context. The civil rights struggle began in the mid-50s, but in general, it was a very repressed era where the left had been forced out of the unions, out of the universities, out of many other areas of life and society in the U.S., and really just a cold hand of reaction was on everything. So it was only by 1959 that our leading Congress felt that it was possible to start this new revolutionary party. Okay. Go on.
So beginning the crisis for all countries of the socialist camp and for the national liberation struggles. For example, in its first few years, Workers' World Party carried out a demonstration to denounce the CIA murder of Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the liberation struggle in the Congo. It raised material support for those in the Black liberation movement who advocated self-defense in the face of racist police and Ku Klux Klan terror. Many of its members participated in a month-long sit-in to win a contract for hospital workers, mainly Black and Latino women, in New York City. It helped to mobilize thousands of campus activists at City College in New York to stop a meeting called by Nazi leader George Lincoln Rockwell. In 1962, Workers' World was instrumental in organizing the first demonstration in the U.S. against the war in Vietnam, which is still being called a police action at the time. Many of these actions were organized by Youth Against War and Fascism, which was the party's youth group in that period.
Okay. The thing about the first demonstration against the war in Vietnam, I just want to again put that statement into the context of what it was like in 1962. We went out with leaflets because a U.S. so-called advisor, who was really a soldier, but he was supposed to be non-combat, was killed in combat in Vietnam because the U.S. troops were in combat in Vietnam. They just didn't call it that yet. And so we put out a leaflet about this, and then called people to a demonstration. And it's hard to believe now, but when we handed that leaflet out about no war in Vietnam and everything, about 90% of the people that we got to talk to didn't know that there was a country named Vietnam. They didn't know if you were talking about a city, a food, a song. They'd never heard of Vietnam. You see how the war that the U.S. brought to Vietnam was what raised people's consciousness here. And the whole idea, which of course was always being pushed, that the U.S., the people in the U.S., wanted to go over there and get rid of communism. The people in the U.S. didn't know anything about Vietnam. How would they know? It had been a French colony. It was, the U.S. took over from the French in trying to stop the revolutionary movement in Vietnam. And so most people in the United States had no knowledge about it at all. And it was really, it was kind of shocking, when you get out on the street and give people a leaflet yourself. It's this, And you think about it now, there's nobody who's conscious of anything. Who's conscious at all, doesn't know what the country of Vietnam is, because the war did that to consciousness here. Also, on this thing about the demonstration against the Nazi leader, again, I want to give you a sense for what we were combating at the time. New York City has a very large Jewish population, and George Lincoln Rockwell was head of a right-wing outfit that called itself the American Nazi Party openly used swastikas and everything as their symbols. You couldn't be more openly a fascist than George Lincoln Rockwell. And he announced he was coming to New York City. I mean, he was actually invited to speak by some group that thought, oh, well, this will start a lively debate. And which was, we took that on. We took on the idea that, oh, you can just have a nice and sweet debate over fascism. Because fascism is murder. Fascism is the murder of the masses, particularly of oppressed groupings who are used as scapegoats by an imperialist state in crisis, which is what Nazi Germany was. And so the idea that you can just debate fascism, it's like, would you just debate somebody whether it's right to carry out mass murder? You have to fight. You have to fight them. And that was our position. But all the liberals in the town, like civil libertarians and all, were saying, oh, no, don't call attention to them. Don't do anything that's going to, bring attention to them. Just leave them alone. Nobody's going to take them seriously. Anyway, so we had this youth organization. It was like the first thing we ever did as a youth group. It was even before we called ourselves the often we called the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee. And we called for a demonstration at Hunter Uptown, which I think it was in the, I don't remember where it was. I know you had to go on a train that went above ground and all that. And we had no idea, how big it would be or anything, but we knew it was the right thing to do. And I remember going up on the train and looking out the window, because it was above ground, and seeing all these people and thinking, gee, I wonder what that is. And it was the people who came to our demonstration. And organizations of concentration camp refugees came with their, people had tattoo numbers on their arms and brought their concentration camp uniforms. And there was a one-day high school teachers strike. So all these high school students came. I mean, it was mostly young people, It was just such a wonderful event. I mean, not only because we did it, but it was because it showed that there was something breaking through at that time from the liberal, wishy-washy attitude of what needs to be done. They wanted to be so polite with people who would want to slit the throats of the oppressed and destroy the working class and all its organizations. They wanted to sit down and have a little nice debate with them. So that was the context for that demonstration and for the beginning of our youth group, which we then quickly decided the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee wasn't comprehensive enough for the problems, because we were already aware of what was going on in Vietnam, even though the big escalation came 2 years later in 1964. And so we changed the name to Youth Against War and Fascism. Okay, so let's go to the next. Unless somebody has a question, we could go to the next paragraph.
Backing for community control. The party has always been in the forefront of taking on hard struggles. For example, a battle began in 1967 for community control of the schools in an African-American community in Brooklyn, New York. Workers' World Party supported the community control struggle, explaining that it was part of the fundamental right of oppressed people to self-determination, as well as being in the real interests of the Union. I want to make a comment here because I came around that during the middle of that struggle. And,
Bill was one of the first youth who came to Dowell at that time. Well, that was 67. He was really a youth. He was like 14.
Anyway, what made it so hard was that the labor movement as a whole, the official labor movement, the unions, the Community Control Board in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, fired 2 white teachers over, I don't remember the specific issue, but over insensitivity, poor behavior towards the students. And this was an assertion, and the official union movement, the United Federation of Teachers, which at the time was almost all white and was very, very right-wing, went on strike and they had the support of almost all the unions. So we, a workers' party, we were standing up against the union movement in the interest of the entire class, because there's no labor solidarity unless you fight racism, and unless the black community and other oppressed communities have the right to self-determination. And our members even went out there and crossed the picket line. Milton Eidenberg was one. I'm sure there were others and taught, in the schools. And I remember we were going out. We'd sell the paper on the street, supporting the black community. And the city. There was a large black community, of course, but it wasn't like a majority. The oppressed people were not a majority in New York City at that time. We'd come out, teachers, and would come out and heckle us and attack us for selling the paper on the street, or for giving out literature on the street in support of the black community in Brownsville. And also a lot of sections of the left in this narrow, view, without seeing, now it's not just workers of the world unite, it's workers and oppressed people of the world unite, supported the teachers' strike. Actually, the U.S. Labor Party, I'm not even sure what they call the LaRouche people, who are fascists now, they were they were a left grouping at the time inside SDS, and they got their start supporting the teachers against the black community, and they went to the right from there.
And it's really important what Bill brought up about the position that the teachers' union took at that time, because the unions, as we all know, have been weakened a lot. And our party's view of unions is that they're very, very important instruments of working class struggle, and they have to be built up. The workers have to have organizations that represent them at their workplace. But one of the great weaknesses of the union movement, especially at that time, was that it not only didn't reach out to third world workers, but it made it almost impossible for them to get into many of the unions. And one of the other things that we did in that period was we joined in with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, in a sit-in at the Plumbers Union office in New York City, because there wasn't one non-white person in the Plumbers Union. And that was a craft union with, better wages and conditions than a lot of other kinds of jobs. You had to train for a certain amount of time to be a licensed plumber and all this and that. And you couldn't get into that union if you weren't white. And I know I had a job working in the clinic of one of the unions that was a lithographers union. And we had the files on everybody who came into the clinic, and it was just almost, it was just like families. There'd be sons and brothers and uncles and fathers, all generations, all with the same last name. It was a very clubby kind of thing to get to be into the field of being a lithographer. You almost had to be related to somebody who was a lithographer. Well, that means you're narrowing, who can get into that union, and especially people who are black, Latino, Native, whatever, couldn't get in. So that was it was a lot different, because later on, as a result of the black struggle and the Chicano Latino struggle and so on, a lot of unions did open up, and now we have a lot of union leaders, who are black. But at that time, the only black union leaders were like the Pullman porters on the trains were black, so that union was black. And one or two other areas that had traditionally been open to black people, because it really was not a job that most white workers wanted, so they would allow black workers into that job. Those unions might have black leadership, but in the rest of the union movement, it was very segregated. Okay, let's go on.
Also in 1967, the party organized a protest against the U.S.-backed Israeli war against Arab people. By this time, the whole U.S. movement was organized against the war in Vietnam, where few would raise their voices in support of the Palestinian people. Workers' World gained out support.
speak on this, but I can just tell you one of the things that happened. By this time, the Vietnam War was a big issue, and there were big coalitions, anti-war coalitions. There was one in New York that was kind of an umbrella group called the Fifth Avenue Parade Committee, because every year it would have a march down Fifth Avenue against the war. And it didn't take very, it took a long struggle in that coalition just to get them to be for withdrawal of troops, U.S. troops from Vietnam. We were fighting in that coalition with others, who were more militant, against the leadership of that coalition. Oh, negotiations. Their slogan was "Negotiate now," meaning that the Vietnamese were supposed to give up something, and then the U.S. would, give up attacking them or something like that. But withdrawal of troops, GIs out, no. It took years of struggle within that coalition to get that to be the position that would be put on the banners and so on. So anyway, then in 1967, Israel launched a war against several Arab countries all at once. And we were the only party on the left that raised to support for the Arab people, including the Palestinians. And the chairperson of our party, who was our theoretical leader and founder, Senator Marcy, and we'll talk about him again more later, he didn't go to the parade committee meetings. Younger comrades would go, and we would be involved with all stuff. We would consult with him. But he was so worked up. And by the way, Sam came from a Jewish background, too. He was so worked up that they had to take a position against what Israel had done, that he went personally himself to this meeting of the parade committee and tried to get the floor to say, look, you're supposed to be against a war, and here's a war by a puppet state, really, created by the imperialists against the people of the Middle East. You got to say something about this. You can't just talk in a narrow way about war when there's another war going on right under our noses here. And these people in the parade committee, they just knew, oh, you don't have the floor. No, next item of business. I mean, we almost stormed had to storm the platform. I don't know if there was a platform, or the chairperson's seat and everything, just to be able to get him to speak. And of course, they immediately voted it down. Oh no, we're not here to discuss this at all. We're here over the Vietnam War. So I'm bringing all this in because I want you to see how the transition from a period of great reaction like the 50s to the radical period in the late 60s was a process that involved many, many, many struggles against those who had sort of been considered leaders of the progressive movement, but who were completely inadequate for what was happening, and would not support a position that was really the right one on the question of imperialist war, on support for the Black liberation movement, on many other issues of that time. Okay, so, yes, go ahead, Bill. Oh, and I can see Dave wants to.
This was terrible as an anti-Muslim, anti-Arab hysteria after 9/11 has been. At least there is now a large Muslim population in this country. There are millions of people from Muslim countries. There are millions of African-American Muslims. And the movement, we've had a history of progressive movement since then, a large part due to our struggle, which has been forced to recognize Palestine. The Israelis even have to admit there is such a thing as Palestine. Back then, the demographics were different, and the mood was different. No one had tackled this question. The mood in New York City during the '67 war, even though it was a massacre of the Arabs by the U.S. armed Israeli forces, there was this anti-Arab hysteria that went unchallenged. And there was hardly a demonstration. We were like between two. On the one hand, we had to face the right wing, the hysteria from the Zionists, but also the majority of the progressive movement, many of whom were Jewish, but that may not even be the main thing. I mean, the Jewish community has historically been progressive. But on this, it was like an Achilles heel. I think not one of the least of Israel's contributions to imperialism is the ability to manipulate the Jewish community. But many people who were consider themselves liberal were raving racists on this. But also, I think there was also organized fascist Zionist groups like the JDL. I don't think there was a single demonstration. It was very rare to have a demonstration on this issue that wasn't physically assaulted by organized groups with lead pipes. We had tear gas thrown into meetings. We had to physically fight just to have the right to raise solidarity with the Palestinian people, with the Arab people on the street. We had to go with helmets. Every demonstration was like a military operation. Then, on the other hand, in the anti-war movement, we were attacked when we'd bring slogans for the Arab people, for Palestine, bring the Palestinian flag, anti-war demonstrations. We'd be attacked by the marshals, by the SWP, was the Socialist Workers' Party, was the biggest force in the anti-war, the controlling force in the anti-war movement at that time. Now they kind of shriveled up to nothing. In '71, I remember being dragged off the stage at a student mobilization meeting by SWP marshals for raising the massacre going on in the Palestinians in Jordan. So it was really, things began to change when the Arab community here began to grow. But it was really a heroic thing we did at that time, and it's anyway.
Dave, actually, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. One of the other things that distinguished us in the early 60s from some of the other groups who for several years didn't even want to hold demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and so well after the escalation and during the Johnson period, 64, 65, when the parade committee was finally formed. But they were very timid on the street and would never do anything that the police didn't completely approve ahead of time. And one of the first that we accomplished that should be remembered was in 1964, when we actually held the first national demonstration against the war in Vietnam. We recruited people from all around the country to come to New York and to march on Times Square. But Times Square was considered off limits for demonstrations. For decades that wasn't allowed, and no one would. And we organized the first demonstration that marched in 1964 to Times Square, was met with a tremendous amount of police repression, and we took considerable arrests. But instead of backing down, what we did was we took that situation and mobilized all of the forces in the city that were against repression and for the right to demonstrate. And we showed that not only could we take up an issue that others didn't want to protest about, but that we could broadly gather together all these forces that were against police repression. And we did a second, several weeks later, maybe a month later, we did a second march. And we did this by organizing first a rally in a hotel room, in a meeting room in a hotel a few blocks away from Times Square. And so instead of people kind of drifting into a demonstration, everybody gathered at this, in this auditorium. And there was a discussion about what we were going to do, and support from observers and cameras and people from all over the city that were going to watch whether the police, and it became a big civil liberties issue in the city. Just an aside, by the way, we were in a coalition with Progressive Labor at the time, and I was doing sound near the stage, and the organizers who were getting people ready for the march and explaining what would happen, mainly people from Youth Against War and Fascism. It happened to be that our organizers and our spokespeople up on the stage were women. So this young guy from Progressive Labor, he looks at me, he says, "What do you got, a matriarchy up there?" It just goes to show the backwardness in the question of women's liberation and equality that some of the left had at that time. If it was all men on the stage, it wouldn't even be a question anyone would notice. So everyone was organized. We marched out of that auditorium, hundreds of people down to Broadway, a lot of media marching there. The police were there like threatening, and we marched in successfully. We broke the ban on demonstrations in Times Square. And that was the first time that that ban was broken, and it was Workers' World Party Youth Against War and Fascism that broke the ban in Times Square for everyone to demonstrate.
In the same way, the Griswold Party was an early supporter of Nicaraguan and Salvadorian revolutions in the struggle of the peoples of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau against Portuguese colonialism. Almost alone in the progressive movement, Workers' World Party denounced the U.S.-backed massacre of close to 1 million progressives in Indonesia, supported the struggle of the people of East Timor for independence, defended the gains of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and in the midst of the ring-wing hysteria surrounding the hostage crisis in Iran, organized demonstrations to demand the Carter administration not give refuge to the hated Shah.
There's a typo there. It should be right there. Yeah, this actually is, as you can see, this is very compressed. It was just, I think, was written just to give a sense of, our commitment to all the anti-imperialist struggles that were going on over decades. I mean, we're talking about the 60s, the 70s, the Iranian Revolution was in 1979. So we're talking about, over a significant period of time. And all of this is not, it's not that we just wrote articles or something. I mean, on every one of these issues, we were out there organizing demonstrations, support for the FRELIMO in Mozambique, in Angola, the MPLA. These are the revolutionary organizations of the liberation struggle. Sometimes these demonstrations would be like 1,000 people. These are big demonstrations. And on Indonesia, Indonesia was a tremendous setback for the movement in Asia, because Indonesia had the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China, the biggest one in the world. It was something like 2 or 3 million members and 15 million people in organizations that the Communist Party of Indonesia had set up, like women's groups, student groups, workers' federations, farmers, peasants groups, and so on. And this was during the Vietnam War. It was a move by the U.S. that in the shadows, the way they do it, that brought about a coup, a military coup in Indonesia that deposed eventually, although they kept him on as a sort of a figurehead for a little while, the president, Sukarno, who was a national leader from the days when they were fighting against Dutch colonialism. Indonesia had been called the Dutch East Indies. It was a whole string of thousands of islands that Holland controlled in Asia. And it was on the way to follow the example that had been set by China and Korea, then Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, of liberating themselves from not just from colonialism, but from imperialism, with a strong communist organized force in this struggle. And it was turned around by the U.S. plotting with the Indonesian generals to take over the power, and they went within a few months. They had killed close to 1 million people in Indonesia, and even today, the people there are just beginning to uncover the mass graves and be able to speak up about what happened. The political problem on this issue at that time was that by this time there was a split in the world communist movement between China and the Soviet Union. And the Indonesian party was affected by it. And some in the Indonesian party were pro-Soviet, some were pro-China. Probably the majority were pro-China. But when their party was being attacked and assaulted, there was so much animosity in the world movement that if if you were in a party that was lined up with supporting the Soviet position, you said, oh, well, it was the pro-China elements in the Indonesian party were rash. They were too, they were ultra left, and that's why it happened. And if you were in a party that was supporting the Soviet Union, you would say, no, the other way around. If you were in a party that was supporting China, you would say, oh, well, it's all because the Indonesian party didn't prepare properly to counteract imperialism. In other words, there was a lot of passivity, but the reason for the passivity was political confusion. Political confusion in a world situation where there was a lot of political confusion. And so we were really alone in raising what was going on and doing something about it. We had a huge rally calling for a public inquest into the massacres. We had demonstrations when the new regime headed by General Suharto was admitted to the United Nations. We demonstrated at the United Nations. We were, putting it out there what the role of the U.S. was behind all this massacres, and they were, acting as though, too bad. Well, it is pretty bloody, but well, that's what happens. Like they didn't have any hand in it. When, in fact, they were very much involved in just in the last 15 years or so. Much more has come out about the role of the CIA, how they actually gave the lists of people to the generals to be slaughtered or put in concentration camps. The CIA did that. They had been preparing to do that. So there were, so this is just like an overview of so many different things that the party was doing at that time. And this was a time when, in the United States, the labor movement was not very active, but in the world situation, the issue of the struggle against imperialism was very hot. So a lot of what we did was, around the issue of fighting imperialism on all these, whether it was what they were doing in Africa or Asia or Latin America, solidarity with Cuba, all these different things. But you should also keep in mind that our goal has always been to be a party of the working class here, which requires concentration on the struggle of the workers. And that's not in conflict with the anti-imperialist work, but it requires balancing everything. When you're a small organization, you have to balance your forces. And when there'd be an opportunity for the party to take an initiative around an issue of a worker struggle, we would do everything we could to be there. But we were also, bringing in many young people who weren't even part of the workforce yet, who were very political and hated racism and they hated imperialism, and we were organizing in all those ways. Okay, so...
Worker World Strikers put out a swell for its militant defense of the last country against murderers. The party supported young lords in their fight against racism and for self-determination, and continues to support the struggle of the Puerto Rican people for independence. When the Chicano-Mexicano people, especially in the Southwest, rose in struggle for their rights and against the U.S. robbery for half of Mexico, Worker World Party was there.
I think that's clear. Do people now know who the young lords were? That was around the same time that the Black Panthers came out of the Black Liberation movement, and they were, they were started by very young people. Especially in the Puerto Rican community, there was a youth group that had come out of what was originally, well, I guess the cops would call them a gang or something, but they were a youth group. They were a youth group called the Young Lords, and they evolved into a political organization that was anti-imperialist for the rights of the Puerto Rican people here to fight for the liberation of Puerto Rico and against the racism in the U.S.
is well known by having more than nothing but academic prisons across the city. Today, the party is in the front ranks of those struggling against police brutality, as well as for the release of all political prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal and the Puerto Rican political prisoners.
Yeah, there was when was that? 71. Yeah, well, this was the 1970s when suddenly, and 70s. Anyway, it was in the 70s particularly, and the prison population in the United States was much smaller then than it is now. You know, it just gives you an idea of what could happen again on a bigger scale. But there were so many oppressed young people, especially in the jails, and at the same time that there were rebellions going on in the jails, there were also rebellions going on in the military stockades, because there was a struggle within the military against the war, against being sent to Vietnam. So it was both in the civilian prisons and it was in the military stockades at the same time that there was, there were rebellion. They would try to burn down the jail cells. They would try to take over a section of a prison and get their demands out. And Attica was the pinnacle of it. And the thing about Attica that was so incredible was that when they got a hold of an area of the prison, which is a maximum security prison now, and got free of the control of the guards, they set up committees to function and run things there that were multinational, had a progressive content, raised very concrete demands for, to improve the conditions of the prisoners. And the response of the governor at that time, Governor Rockefeller, was to send in, I guess it was the National Guard, was it state police, and massacre them. They killed so many guards at the same time. That's what happened. And later, there was an investigation by Congress of Attica, what had happened in Attica. And it came out that, this was something that could have been avoided, death, and so on. The prisoners were not responsible for most of the deaths. It was the cops who did it. But, but it was a huge, huge thing at the time. And we were in it. We had an organization called the Prisoner Solidarity Campaign. We used to help. See, especially in New York State, they've put all these prisons that are mostly full of Black and Latino young people way in the far reaches of the state, in the middle of what were then all white communities. Probably aren't anymore. But at that time, they were all white communities, very racist areas, very, very conservative. And it was very hard for the families of those incarcerated to even get to visit them. Because the visiting hours would start at like 8 in the morning. They lived in New York City, they didn't have cars. And so they would have to go, stay overnight in a hotel and stuff like that. They didn't have any money, to get there, to stay over, to be able to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning at the prison, to meet their family members for a couple of hours before the visiting hours would be over. So the Prisoner Solidarity Campaign helped to organize, buses, people to go and visit, and just in general, try to make some contact to those who were behind bars and just kind of just feel like they had no contact with the outside world. But when the Attica prison rebellion took place, the prisoners themselves asked the Prisoner Solidarity to send a press secretary to see what was happening and to tell the outside world what they had to say. And we were very, very proud that we were able to do that. Marcia.
The Prisoner Solidarity Committee was actually formed in response to letters that were sent from Auburn prisoners who were struggling in Auburn prison, which is not far, it's near Rochester, it's not far from Attica, really, it's in upstate New York. And they had sent letters out to everybody that they could think, everybody in the movement. And this was actually my first party conference. It was a special winter conference between 1970, 1971 over that New Year's. And I remember the letters being read and it being, I think I remember Sam speaking about how, responding to this, and the Prison Solidarity Committee became a response to that. And the thing about the Prison Solidarity Committee also was that it was a way for the party to explain that it was concentration camps, prisons were concentration camps for the poor, that it was part of capitalism, that it was the working class that was in the prisons, and also that these struggles were part of the national liberation struggles that were happening all over the world, and especially the Black liberation struggle and Latino liberation struggle, and an added to the Native liberation struggles in this country. So the Prison Solidarity Committee, concretely supported the families by providing this transportation and politically published the letters that had come out of Auburn and had demonstrations out in front of the Auburn prison and supported these prisoners who were struggling in Auburn. And some of those prisoners had been transferred to Attica also. And when the Attica Rebellion happened, the Prison Solidarity Committee was known, and it was requested that there be a representative from the Prison Solidarity Committee, from the party really, to be inside as one of the observers during when they were trying to negotiate. But it was also, politically, which now even, the situation now is getting the prison industrial complex.
Okay, so now the next one is the fight against sexual oppression.
WFP in the struggle of undocumented workers, women workers fighting job discrimination, as well as to defend affirmative action. WFP made a major contribution to Marxist theory and practice by explaining theoretically the basis for women's as well as lesbian, gay, trans, and bisexual oppression. Since the 1970s, we have stated that this oppression came from class society and was not just a lifestyle, but a specific oppression.
Okay. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we still have a book that the party put out, I think, in the 70s called The Roots of Lesbian and Gay Oppression, that our comrade Bob McCubbin, who's in California now, wrote at that time. And it was a real groundbreaking book because it was explaining, in the light of Marxism and the contributions of, particularly of Frederick Engels, who was Marx's closest collaborator and who studied different societies and was very excited about, for example, what was then being learned. They were alive in the 1800s. So what was then being learned for the first time about Native communities in the Western Hemisphere and how they didn't have private property. They didn't have, they weren't divided into classes. They had a communal-based society. And Engels wrote a book called Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State that uses some of that, what was then very new, fresh anthropological studies to show how class oppression has not been eternal. Human society has not been divided into oppressors and oppressed, but for most of human history, people lived in a communal setting where things were shared in common and where they worked together in order to survive against the harshness of, the climate and all this and that, and share food and help them build their dwellings together and so on. And that's the major portion of human history is in societies of that type. And Bob McCubbin was able to relate that to the whole question of lesbian and gay oppression, as it was understood at the time that he wrote it, and show that it does come out of class society. So it's a very important book we have. If you haven't, seen it yet, you might want to read it. And then there was a book that Comrade Dorothy Ballin, who was another founder of the party, wrote called Feminism and Marxism, which took up some of these same questions, but in a kind of way of dealing with views that were being put forward in the women's liberation movement at that time, or maybe I wouldn't call it the women's liberation movement, more like the feminist movement at the time, and critiquing them because some of those views did really wanted to leave out the whole issue of class as having anything to do with women's status in society, and saw it more as a male versus female thing. And so Dorothy's book is a critique of that view.
And race too. And race too.
And race, yes, absolutely. Yes, race too. I mean, racism, as we know it, has become, I think, particularly intensified with the age of imperialism. In the last couple of hundred years. Although, I mean, in the early years of capitalism, you had the slave trade. So I guess you could say it goes back a long way, the horrible racism of capitalist society. But racism really developed under capitalism in a way different, I think, than under, say, feudalism or even ancient slavery, because ancient slavery was not based on the race, but really on conquest in battle, and whoever, lost in a battle, their people could be taken as slaves. Now that's ancient. Slavery in the ancient world was different than slavery in the Western Hemisphere once the Europeans came over and established big plantations and wanted slave labor for them.
No, but I think in the women's movement there wasn't much challenging the racism, right? And that was what Dorothy's book kind of took on, right?
I guess. I think so. I don't know all the points in the book. Maybe somebody else could.
Well, yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, you just read it, but you could say.
Well, I mean, it took on because I wasn't around during that time, but apparently during that time, the women's movement was, obviously there were women of color who were fighting for women's liberation, but like the large women's movements were largely white-led and ignored like the fact that women of color face added oppression because they're people of color and they're women, and they face added discrimination. And so part of that book also challenged that and said, no, you have to pay attention to the special oppression that women of color face. So.
One thing I remember is our women's caucus. There were several feminist groups who were attacking the Black Panther Party for male chauvinism. At the same time, they were being murdered by cops. And our women's caucus put out flyers defending the Black Panther Party and fought inside them. When the Panthers organized the People's Constitutional Convention, we were fighting, the Off Women's Caucus was fighting in defense of the Panthers against a whole sea of attacks by petty bourgeois women's organizations on the Panthers. Considered inadequacy on the women's question. Actually, the Panthers were in the vanguard in many ways. Huey Newton's statement in 69 or 70 about women's liberation and gay and LGBT oppression was a groundbreaking thing.
Okay. So, who wants to read the next part about the anti-war movement? Where are we now? David? Okay.
Leaders in the anti-war movement. In the recent period,
By the way, in the recent period,
That's 10 years ago.
The 90s. Yeah, when under the first Bush administration, and then the Clinton administration, there was a brief war against Iraq. Right? And there were other things happening too. So it's talking about, anyway, when it says the recent period, it's talking about that period, the 90s. Or the 80s. The 80s and 90s. I'm sorry.
So, in the recent period, WWP has played a leading role in the development of the anti-imperialist movement, linked to the defense of revolutionary movements abroad to the demand for jobs and social services here at home. An historic expression of this approach was the May 3rd, 1981 march of 100,000 people on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. to demand jobs and social services, not racism and war in El Salvador. It played a role in the anti-apartheid movement, especially in building support for the African National Congress of South Africa and SWAPO of Namibia. We've supported the struggles of Native peoples from the Battle of Wounded Knee to the defense of political prisoner Leonard Peltier, from the Dene and Hopi people of Big Mountain to the United American Indians of New England.
Okay, so actually, later on it talks about Iraq. And in this paragraph, in the 80s, early 80s, was this horrible war that the U.S. was really responsible for in El Salvador. And it was the party comrades who pulled together a coalition for a huge demonstration in Washington. It was the first. It was a very important demonstration in many, many ways. It was the first big national anti-war demonstration since the Vietnam War period. And in the Vietnam War period, as I think was explained earlier, we were a very important force on the left in the anti-war movement, but we were not leaders of the anti-war movement at all. And so we didn't have a lot of impact on the character of the big demonstrations that took place and who got to speak and all this and that. But this demonstration we did. This was the first anti-war movement, anti-war rally, national rally, that had a lesbian, gay, a speaker from the LGBT community, the first ever. It was the first ever to have a native speaker, ever, first anti-war demonstration. And it was the first demonstration to have a Palestinian speaker. It was the first of those three things. They had never been, those struggles had never been represented in the big anti-war demonstrations before that. And it was because of the party. And we, fought very hard to pull together a coalition. And we had, it was not easy to get everybody on board for this. It was a constant struggle, but it turned out to be highly successful.
It was also the first big protest of the Reagan era, and everybody was running because after Reagan came in, a lot of the left said fascism is taking over the country, you better run and hide. People were talking about leaving the country, going into hiding. And we said, no, you have to fight it. And people said, you can't have a demonstration now. So the fact that we got 100,000 people to Washington was unbelievable. It was an incredible breakthrough at the time. So that was, a success in two ways, both, the fact that the party could do it and also fighting the idea that you couldn't fight against Reagan. So that it was possible to fight the right and organize.
Okay. Yes, Tony.
I also wanted to mention a very important thing about that demonstration in 1981, which was that we struggled in this coalition to make sure that the Palestinian struggle was raised on the stage. And it was, I think, the first time in a major anti-war demonstration in this country that the Palestinian struggle was raised.
Okay. So, should we go to the next point?
Party has made major contributions to strategy and tactics of LeiLani, organizing for a moratorium on plant closings, the job is a worker's right, and calling for one-day national work stoppage. More recently, we have played a primary role in the efforts of workers to organize. In the 1990s, the party has distinguished itself by the leading role it has played in opposing U.S. invasions of Grenada and Panama, the genocidal U.S.-led war and sanctions against Iraq, as well as the U.S.-led invasion of Somalia.
Grenada and Panama were in the 90s?
No, 80s.
More recently, the party has protested against the Pentagon's massive military operations in the Balkans, the U.S. missile attacks against the Afghanistan and Sudanese capital, Khartoum, as well as Washington's increasing pressure on revolutionary Cuba.
So what we're doing today, as you can see, is directly related to the party's whole history in terms of taking on, as soon as we know what the next target of imperialism is, we're out there trying to, develop a strong response to it. Oh, workfare. What's workfare? Okay. Where's it here? Oh yeah, more recently we have played a primary role in the efforts of workplace workers to organize. This is under the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration. There was a major blow to the working class with the dismantling of the welfare program in this country. Welfare was one out of the struggles of the 1930s when there was massive unemployment and nothing to fall back on. I mean, you didn't even have unemployment insurance in those days, but as you all know, unemployment insurance only lasts for a certain amount of time, and you have to have a job on the books and all that to be able to apply for it in the first place. And so welfare was, when the Depression came, I mean, many people were facing starvation in the Depression. And welfare was one out of the massive struggles of the 30s to keep at least so that people could have enough of an income to survive a period of great, economic crisis. Now, what happened in the ensuing decade when the U.S. got out of the Depression, and we would have periodic ups and downs in the economy, but when most workers were able to find work, is that more and more there began to be this real division between the oppressed communities of color and the white workers in terms of being able to get work, in terms of job availability. So that the unemployment level, say in the black community, could be at Depression levels. But the country as a whole was not seen as being in a depression, it was seen as like prosperity. But for oppressed people of color, it was like the Depression. And there was the need for welfare to fall back on was very great. And that was also true for a lot of white workers too, because the majority of people getting welfare were white. But there was a racist campaign against welfare for many years, pushed by the right wing. And they finally began to dismantle it and turned into something called workfare, where, people shouldn't be just lying around collecting government checks. You've got to go out there and work. It was a way also to attack the unions of civic, municipal workers, people who used to clean up the parks and the streets and get paid a union wage for it. They were getting laid off, and people were getting a welfare check for doing the same kind of work, but at like 1/4 what the organized union workers would have gotten. So it was all around. It was a real blow at the working class, both the most oppressed and just workers in general, helping the bosses in their campaign to push down the wage levels in this country. And that's what workfare was. And the Congress, made an effort to try to organize workfare workers against this program, and at the same time fight to try and restore some kind of support for people who don't, who need it. Now, you've got people all over this country who are in crisis because the jobs are drying up, the salaries have gotten so low, the debt is overwhelming, and they can't turn to. There's no welfare program for them to turn to if they can't meet their bills. And so, you can see why, again, we need to struggle over this right of workers that they are entitled to either a job or an income. And working people are entitled to that. I mean, if we had a social society, there would be jobs for everybody. Because there's all kinds of things to be done to improve human life. And everybody really wants to work who can do it, who's able to do it. And even people who are very disabled want to work in some way or another and be productive and develop their abilities and all this stuff. People really don't want to just sit around. But you can't, under capitalism, there's a built-in reserve of unemployed workers. That's guaranteed to exist as long as there's capitalism. That there will always be what Marx called a reserve army of labor. That is a form of increasing the competition among workers to get a job, and therefore forces wages to be low. Julie.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add on, thinking of our history of our work in the current role against the war in Iraq, that we organized the first major national demonstration against the war before anybody was doing it, and I think it was the one right before that congressional declaration that Hillary Clinton is now famous for agreeing to. That we had this. It was at a time where I think similar maybe to what Deirdre was talking to about, like early in the Vietnam War, where right after 9/11, all of the progressive groups had completely retreated. And we were the first ones to organize against the war in Afghanistan, against the war in Iraq, to put a coalition together, and it was hugely successful, but none of the leadership was organizing for it nationally, and we were. And also that because of our work in the anti-sanctions movement in the 90s, we knew when Bush was raising all these, these red herrings about weapons of mass destruction and so forth in Iraq, we knew that all of that was lies, and we were able to, tell that to people that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was very clear, based on our history in the sanctions movement, that was all, a lie from the beginning. And we were a major part of these, hundreds of thousands of people that were coming out in the streets before the war in Iraq, and obviously people who are familiar with us today continue to know our work in the anti-war movement.
I wanted to, you might want to say something too, because some of that's about work fairness, about work fairness. But during that time, people were really, who had tremendous health problems, were forced to do these jobs. Some people even died of heart attacks and other things because they really weren't equipped to being forced to go back to work. And women with children, that was, a big part of the welfare program. I myself was on that program before I became a nurse. And, it provided an income for women who had children who had no other way. And that was, they like to rave about Clinton, but Clinton was the one in 1996 who disseminated this program. And years later, I remember I did a talk on International Women's Day in San Francisco, and the studies had shown that the unbelievable poverty that happened for women as relatives, because those jobs that were supposed to exist for these women never existed. There were no jobs. They went off welfare, and then there was nothing for them. So it was just, they went deeper and deeper into poverty. So, and I was, something was won, right, in the workfare struggle that we went through the 80s, and I can't remember what that was. Did we win something during those years?
I feel a little put on the spot because I don't remember. Our campaign, we hooked up with the big city union, DC 37, and we said workfare workers should be. We're union jobs. This should be union jobs, and we were calling for them to be organized into the union, and we got actually put on staff with the union. And that union at the time, the leadership was very bad and was trying to actually support Giuliani at the same time that they were, but they put us on staff as a result of the political pressure that we put on them. So we did as much as we could, given the sort of limited support that they actually gave us, but we felt it was the right place to be to push them in the right direction. And the thing that and we organized a big demonstration when one of the workfare workers died. She was forced, and this was characteristic of what they did. They forced people into these jobs, and they also used this program just to force people off welfare. They create all kinds of administrative problems with their benefits, and then people have to go back, and some people just left for good. This one woman said, "I can't do this work, I have a condition." And they said, "We don't accept." We hired our own doctors. Our doctors say you're fine. She went out into the sun in July or August, worked all day, and died of a heat stroke. And we did a demonstration about that, and we did a lot of other demonstrations. But we won a lot of fair hearings, which were these. The city set up a situation where you could confront them about your benefits being taken away. And it was really stacked against you, but we had people go in with people on welfare as their representatives. And we, as if they were, there was nothing, shop stewards, they weren't lawyers, they're just people who were like our activists and said, we're going to go in and represent you. And we won a lot of cases doing that. The campaign itself pretty much died when the leadership of the union got caught fixing votes for Giuliani. If you can believe that. They got caught fixing votes for Giuliani, and they got voted out, and they ended the program that we pushed them to build. So.
And today they call web workers, WT, work experience people. If wants to work, like it's been said, if you don't work a certain number of hours a week, you don't get your money. And it's such a degrading thing, because I've known web workers who they're made to believe that they work real hard, they do real good, be there every day, blah blah blah. All of us feel that way anyway. That you got to do that job.
Right.
But they especially are pressured to just give it their all, so that then later down the road, next year, 10 years from now, they get hired by the city. So just web workers out there.
I'll tell a personal experience I had. When all this was going on in the city, I had a job working for a consortium of unions that provided adult education classes in various subjects, one of which was how to use computers, and that's what I was teaching. And they started, most of the time I was teaching, you have union members who wanted to learn computers in their spare time. And for various reasons, for their personal use or because they thought that they could get a better job or if they had some computer skills or whatever. But then, this one year, they introduced this new class that I had me teaching, which was all women on welfare with kids who were being taught how to use the computer for a very specific reason. There was a deal that the unions were trying to work out with the city, where these women would make their homes into daycare centers. But they all had like 1 or 2 kids themselves. They were supposed to take 2 or 3 more kids during the day, and they were supposed to be like online all the time to some central office that would be, running the whole thing. And that's how they would, put their hours in and get paid and deal with any problems that came up and all this and that. And that's why we were teaching. And the women were so skeptical, I can't tell you, that any of this was ever going to come to fruition, that it would ever be a real job. And I used to ask after, I'd say, did the women in that program ever get this job? No, because it all depended on the city subsidizing this child care, because these women lived in the projects, most of them. Their neighbors, who were the ones whose kids they were supposed to be taking care of, couldn't afford $500 or whatever it was for child care. They didn't have the money. So it would have to be city funded, it would have to be subsidized in some way. Anyway, this whole thing went on for like a year or so, and then they all dropped it. And the women, meanwhile, when they would come in, they knew that probably it was never going to help them. But in the meantime, they were supposed to come to class several times a week and spend their own money for car fare, which they didn't have. And they would have to haggle, with the director of the program to get just the $1 or $2 or whatever it was that they spent each time they had to come to class. I mean, that's how, half-assed all this stuff was that was being done. Why didn't they just take that money and, put it into a fund where the women could get real jobs, let the city find work at proper wages,
But was that they would lose their benefits if they didn't go to this class program?
Oh, yeah.
That's the way they organized a lot of this.
Yeah.
And not to go on about this, but a lot of this was just a way to hurt the unions, and a lot of it ended up being a big giveaway to a lot of corporations. Like they advertised that the city was going to set up these agencies, which they privatized. It was Giuliani said, we're going to now take these people off of welfare and make them go to work, and we've created this new city agency run by this private corporation called Maximus, I think that they were called. and they're going to oversee the transfer of these people into jobs. And Maximus, 2 years later, it was discovered that they took all that money that the city gave them and just stole it. It was even a scandal within their world that they were supposed to use the money to help these people get jobs, and they used the money just to get rich. They outright stole the money, and it was, it became a scandal later, and everybody said, "Oh, yeah, workfare, I remember that." At this point, they'd all made off with the money, and nobody got jobs out of it.
So I think one of the things we want to point out here is that, it was difficult. That Tony was showing how, with the union leadership at that time, very conservative and, just sort of like not interested in struggle at all. It was difficult for a party like ours to have an impact through the union movement. But we always looked for ways in which we could be involved in the struggles of our class, and especially the most oppressed sections of the class. Those who are the most oppressed by capitalism. And so this is one example of a way we found to be part of that, and try to do something about what was happening to the people who were on welfare. And at the same time, show to the unions, look, you got to get into this, because this is going to, in the long run, bring down the conditions of the workers that have unions and have jobs, and lead to layoffs and all this and that. And you're short-sighted if you don't realize that. Okay, so let's see. Let's go to the next part. That starts more recently. The party has protested. We did that? About revolutionary Cuba?
Yeah, we did.
Okay. So it's defense of the socialist camp would be the next thing.
The party's unswerving defense of the socialist perspective and the socialist camp in the face of imperialist attacks has made it possible to continue the revolutionary struggle when so many other organizations have become disoriented, confused, or have abandoned the fight. Because of this defense of socialism, we opposed the false democracy movement in China in 1989, which was actually a capitalist attack on the People's Republic. In the same vein, we early on opposed the so-called reforms of perestroika in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. These reforms have proven to be, in reality, an attempt to recreate capitalism. We here in the U.S. know from experience what capitalism is all about: exploitation for super profit, with no concern for human life. The result is unemployment, hunger, homelessness, racism, sexism, imperialist war, the destruction of the environment, and every other evil faced by our society today. Evils that have reemerged in the countries of the former socialist camp.
Yeah, this, by the way, our party has really an incredible role in giving a lot of very detailed and extremely thoughtful analysis of the problems within the socialist countries, some of which are no longer socialist countries, and what was happening to them, and defending what was right about them. And at the time, before the Soviet Union fell, in so much of the so-called progressive movement, there was nothing but criticism. There was nothing but, workers' paradise, yeah, right, ha, ha, ha. Like, conditions for the workers were so terrible. But once the Soviet Union fell apart, the conditions for workers there got 10 times worse. They had never, perhaps, been, in terms of income for workers, as high as the West, which had become rich over centuries of imperialist and colonial plunder around the world, right? And could afford to allow a higher standard of living at home if they could keep the workers at home passive enough to continue with their colonial plunder and their wars and all that. That's why they did it. But in the Soviet Union and in the countries of Eastern Europe, even though they didn't have the high level of wealth of the countries of the West, the workers' conditions, in many ways, led the world. I mean, in terms of vacations and health care and education and places to go on your holiday that would be paid for through your job, and all of this. I mean, you know, there was such pressure from the workers' revolutions in Europe, especially like in Eastern Europe, on Western Europe, that in Western Europe they had to make a lot of concessions. That's why in Western Europe they have even today, better vacations, better health care, and all that we have here in the United States. The United States is, you know, the richest, most strongest imperialist country in the world. But workers here don't have anything like what European workers are used to having. And the workers in Western Europe got those things because the capitalists were afraid of the competition from the socialist system in the eastern part of Europe and in the Soviet Union. That's really what it was all about. I mean, they initiated so many things like free comprehensive health care in the socialist countries, long before any capitalist country ever had it. Free education, guaranteed job, the right to a job, guaranteed that everybody can have a job. That was the socialist countries that did that. So when we were, you know, pointing out, we were not like a lot of the communist parties around the world that would just overlook the problems and the mistakes that were being made by the leadership in the socialist countries. We weren't like that. We saw them, but we analyzed them from the point of view of how do you strengthen these countries? How do you strengthen the revolutionary movement in the world and the socialist countries? And how do we support them in a way that would take some of the pressure off them that the imperialists are constantly putting on them? I mean, especially the Soviet Union. They lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation from 1945 until 1991. The U.S. had plans drawn out in detail for nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. There's a terrific book called How to Win a Nuclear War that was written after stuff on the U.S. nuclear program from the 50s was declassified because of the Freedom of Information Act, you know. And it's all based on these declassified documents. Shows in detail how close the U.S. came to launching a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet leaders, they knew that, you know, and they were worn down over time. And I think your remark, Bill, in the meeting the other night, Thursday night, about how some of them maybe hoped that by giving in to the imperialists, they would get out from under this shadow of war. Well, look what's happening right now. There is no Soviet Union anymore, but because Russia is now viewed by the U.S. as a still very powerful military force and a competing capitalist country that won't just become one of their, you know, puppets, one of the countries they can just push around and tell them what to do, they're threatening them with war now. You know, Bush is making bellicose threats. Condoleezza Rice has gone over there. If Cheney doesn't say anything, it may be just because, you know, he's so discredited that he wouldn't help their cause. But that's what they're focusing on right now, and they're making all kinds of new threats against Russia. And but the threats were even greater during the years of the existence of the Soviet Union. So we were constantly coming to their defense, especially when they did the right thing by the national liberation struggles around the world and so on. I mean, and they did a lot. And the Cuban Revolution, for example, couldn't have survived without the Soviet Union, and Fidel has more or less said that. I mean, they were, totally blockaded by the U.S. They wouldn't have been able to get food or anything if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union. And the first big test was when the U.S. cut off oil supplies to Cuba in the spring of 1961, and preparatory for the Bay of Pigs invasion, which came a little bit later, or maybe it was even before that. I think it was actually in 1960 that they started to cut off the oil supplies. And it was the Soviet Union that came forward and brought oil to Cuba to be able to find so that their industries could continue. Otherwise, their industries would have gone to a halt. So the Soviet Union was extremely important, not only for, as a revolution that was a revolution for socialism and was a working class revolution, but also for its impact on the oppressed countries under the heel of various imperialist powers all around the world, and it unleashed a whole decades, of struggle to get free of colonial and imperial domination. And just the thing that is mentioned here about China in 1989, that's what everybody has come to think of as the Tiananmen Square. I mean, it's not mentioned here as Tiananmen Square, but that was when what seemed to be an innocent, just student demonstration that went on in Tiananmen Square suddenly turned into this violent struggle where there were attacks on young Chinese soldiers who were not battle-hardened soldiers. They were young people from the countryside who had come into the city fearing that there was going to be like a counter-revolutionary uprising, and which happened, just shortly after that in the Soviet Union, and it was a real assault on China as a socialist country. It really was, but it gave the appearance of something much more innocent. But it was really, the U.S. at the time, even in the New York Times, and so they were talking about how there could be divisions within the Chinese military, how they could get this one on their side and that one on their side. China was under the same kinds of threats and pressures as the Soviet Union, that the U.S. had been piling on them. And so there were some in the Chinese leadership who would be subject to those kinds of threats. And that's what was going on in this particular reference here. And perestroika, perestroika was the program begun under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union starting in 1985. That was to reform the economy, and that eventually led to the destruction of the Soviet Union. And we have a terrific book that was written by the chairperson of the party, Sam Marcy, that critiqued perestroika as it was developing. The book is a series of articles that appeared while this was all happening, and it's really interesting. Okay, so this last bit, some people would like to read it, but it's like why you should join the party. So who would like to read this last part? Okay, Macaulay.
Okay, so let's see. Now for a word from our socialist future. Join in the struggle with WWP, Workers' World Party, and help to build a workers' world. For almost, and at this point now, for almost 50 years, Workers' World Party has applied its revolutionary Marxist perspective to the struggle here at home and around the world. We have fought for the rights of oppressed people to self-determination, defended women's reproductive rights, struggled against the oppression of lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people, supported the fight to end AIDS, defended the rights of workers to unionize, and this right for better paying conditions. We have battled homelessness, organized against the KKK, the Nazis, the Aryan Nation, the Minutemen, etc. Supported the struggles of youth, students, the elderly, the disabled, undocumented and workfare workers, prisoners, and veterans. Fought the corporate assault on the environment, opposed Washington, imperialist wars, and the profit system that spawns them. If you want to fight against capitalism and all its attendant evils, if you believe that people can create a rational, humane society based on meeting people's needs and not on amassing super profits, if you want to fight for socialism, then Workers' World Party is for you. And then let us know if you would like to meet with us, like today, talk more about joining the party. Fill out the form below and return it to maybe March over. So, and return it to us at the conference or send it to right here.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks for your updates. Okay, so how do you all feel? Should we just have some general discussion on what we've already covered? I have another document I thought we would get to, but we can have that for the next, for the next session because it's almost 5. And that's really getting into our party's ideology. And because what we've really been going over, as I said before, is the highlights of what the party has done. And it's not even brought up to date in this particular piece. But some of you know from recent experience what we're doing now, and you can see how it's consistent with this long history of struggle. And the next thing we need to talk about is, what are our general views that lead us to believe that these struggles are going to build the movement, are going to help move society forward. We've seen, maybe not in this period so much, I think it happened earlier, but we saw a lot of demoralization, like in the 70s, in the early 80s. A lot of people who had become radical dropped out, and they dropped out for a reason, various reasons probably, but a lot of it had to do with not having a broader view of what the problem really is. That we're not just fighting a bad administration in Washington. We're not just fighting against a policy of the government that if you change that policy, then everything is going to be all right. We're fighting against a whole system of, an economic system. That the politics of the government flows from the economic system. And that's capitalism. In the stage of huge monopolies that are now dominant, not only in the U.S. economy, but dominant in the whole world economy. And so, understanding where things are coming from helps you understand better where we're going and what the possibilities are for achieving a really unbreakable change, a new social system, which we are absolutely convinced is on the order of the day. That, one of the things that Sam Wesley used to point out is that no social system leaves the stage of history until its potential for developing the means of production has been exhausted. And that's really very important to get deeply understand that relationship between economics and politics. That a system can be mean and nasty and exploitive and enslave people and everything, but if it's developing the means of production, it's very hard to get rid of it. But if there's a superior system that can do better with developing the means of production so that people's needs are truly met, it will overcome. And what we're saying now is that capitalism can produce a lot of goods, maybe, and other times maybe it doesn't produce so much and goes into a big financial and economic crisis. But it also, I'm constantly struck by the contrast between New York City and Beijing right now. In New York City in 2001, as we all know, the World Trade Center was destroyed. There's been a big hole there for the last 7 years. And maybe they filled in the hole a little bit by now. But for 7 years, the capitalist class in this city and nationally has not been able to do anything with that valuable piece of real estate. They're fighting each other. The competing capitalist interests are so great. The real estate powers in the city, the banks. I mean, they'll tell you, they haven't decided yet on the design or this or that. But it's like a feeding frenzy by the sharks. They can't do anything because they're just like fighting over this, right? So there it sits. That big hole sits in downtown Manhattan. In China, the whole city of Beijing has been completely rebuilt in about the same period of time. You would have to see it to believe it. I was there 5 years ago or something, and if you got towards the edge of the city where there's hills, and you get like up a little high, and you could see like the whole skyline, I think you could see 1,000 cranes silhouetted against the sky. They were putting up new buildings everywhere. And not just buildings, but broad avenues and mass transit and bicycle lanes and trees parks. I mean, they were rebuilding that city, and that was just Beijing, and it's been happening all over China. Now, I'm not saying that everything is perfect in China. We know there's a big capitalist class in China, and there's a big capitalist, effect on China. But China is accomplishing an enormous amount because of its revolution, and because a state was created that is not just the property of this and that lobbyists for banks and defense contractors and insurance companies and so on that we have here. It's not that kind of a state. And in China, there's the feeling and the reality that, say, take environmental questions. We hear China attacked all the time on environmental questions. I subscribe to a science magazine that comes out of Britain. They just had a big article about how China right now is doing incredible stuff to completely revise all their energy sources to be as clean as possible, to be as renewable as possible. It's underway in China. They're doing away with small coal-burning, generating plants. They're turning to they're building stuff with the much more modern technology that scrubs the emissions that come out of factories and plants like that. Why are they able to do this? Because the fact that you still have a huge section of the economy that is state-owned means that it's understood that if there's an assault on the environment, it's affecting all the Chinese people, and it's affecting their society, and their society belongs to the Chinese people. So they're hurting from it. But when you live in an imperialist country like this, ExxonMobil may pretend that they're trying to help clean up the environment, but they don't have to pay for the results of the pollution and all this. It's picayune compared to what they really get from running roughshod over the economy. So, capitalism is holding back the rational development of the means of production. That's what I'm saying. It is holding it back, and it's in a visible way. We think of, the older capitalism so impetuous in growing the means of production, growing industry, the Industrial Revolution, and all that. But today, socialism will do a much better job, an incredibly better job, of reorganizing the whole world to be a livable place, and where production is really to meet people's needs. And it's seeping into the consciousness of people everywhere. It's part of the class struggle. It's part of the struggle against every form of oppression. It's the struggle against these huge corporations that dominate everything in the capitalist world. And they are holding back. They are holding back humanity's progress. And that is going to doom them in the end. That, not by automatically, but through the intervention of the masses of people to overthrow them, but it weakens them in relationship to the workers. It weakens them in relationship to anybody who's thinking